They mocked me every single day, just because of my growing belly. People laughed like it was some crime to be pregnant without a ring on my finger. Girls like her shouldn't be anywhere near a wedding bouquet. I overheard one coworker whisper, while another neighbor sneered and slapped a note on my door, "Don't let her stay here. She's a disgrace to the whole building." I had no clue the man from that one unforgettable night was actually a billionaire, and at that very moment, he was tearing the city apart Lou Barrett for me. Meanwhile, I was in the tiny back room of Bloom and Grace, a humble little flower shop tucked on the edge of Old Port District. I stood at a worn wooden table, carefully trimming the stems of newly delivered roses. The room smelled like damp soil and sharp fertilizer, usually a smell I found comforting. Lately though, every breath felt heavier, like it carried more than just scent. I wore my usual clothes, a stretched-out sweater that barely fit over my growing belly, soft pants clinging to thighs fuller than they used to be, and a pair of flats that had clearly seen better days. My boss, Ms. Hartley, moved around the shop like I didn't exist unless it was to bark something mean in my direction. I used to be just the quiet one. Now that my body had changed, her tolerance turned to open contempt. "What are you doing, standing there like some lost soap opera character?" Ms. Hartley snapped, motioning toward a bucket of wedding bouquets. "We've got a bride pick Barrett up in an hour. If you can't focus, I'll find someone who can do more than just hold scissors." I tried to mumble an apology, but my voice caught before it could form. Instead, I turned back to the roses, trying to stay steady with each snip of the shears. There was a time, not long ago, when she used to greet me with a lukewarm smile. But now, somehow, my belly had changed how the whole world looked at me. Maybe I was a Wall Barrett scandal in their eyes, a reminder of mistakes, of loneliness. A woman pregnant and alone, with no name to offer for the father. I swallowed the sigh rising in my throat and focused on the white daisies, trying not to let my hands shake too much. Once the roses were trimmed, I tied them with satin ribbons and tucked in a few sweet-smelling fillers. Customers came and went. Some gave my belly a pointed glance, others shared smug little grins with Ms. Hartley like they were all in on some joke I wasn't part of. A few avoided me entirely, like standing too close might infect them with shame. Part of me had expected it. I grew up seeing how fast a woman could be judged, how a whisper could snowball into a reputation. My mother, quiet and kind, wore thrift clothes and bore the town's comments about our lack of class like invisible bruises. She always told me to keep my chin up, even when her own shoulders sagged under years of whispers. So I tried to carry myself the same way. Calm. Composed. Even when each comment felt like a slap. Halfway through my shift, Jenna brushed past me carrying a bunch of hydrangeas. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to catch it. "Kinda weird, being surrounded by all these wedding flowers, huh? Doesn't it sting, considering your situation?" It was the kind of comment that wore a fake smile, sounding sympathetic on the surface, but sharp enough underneath to cut. I didn't say anything back. Just took a deep breath in and out, then went back to arranging the lilies in front of me. I reminded myself that starting an argument could cost me the one job I had left. Rent was only paid up for a few more weeks, and after that, eviction wasn't just a threat, it was a clock tick Barrett down. I had no one to lean on. No husband, no partner, just the little life growing inside me, pressing gently outward every day, reminding me that time was short and money even shorter. By the time closing rolled around, the tension in the flower shop had gone from thick to hostile. Ms. Hartley approached while I was sweeping up petals and leaves. Her voice was all sugary fake kindness, but the poison was right there in every word. "I don't want to see you here tomorrow," she said, like she was doing me a favor. "We need that space for a new hire. Someone who can manage heavier work. Your current condition makes you a bit less, let's say, flexible. Let's just consider this a mutual parting." My broom stopped mid-sweep. I looked at her, really looked, searching for even a flicker of warmth. But her eyes were cold, cold like the inside of the flower fridge. Maybe there was a flicker of pity, or maybe it was satisfaction, getting rid of someone she saw as flawed. I gave a small nod. Yes, was all I could say. I finished sweeping without another word, ignoring the pounding ache in my temples. The job barely paid enough to keep the power on, but it had been something steady. And now, that small piece of stability was gone. I walked out of Bloom and Grace without saying goodbye. No one looked up. Outside, the city roared around me, horns blaring, people crossing intersections in a blur, cars weaving through traffic. I kept my head down, hands stuffed into my coat pockets. Inside one of those pockets was the only thing I truly held dear, a small, soft handkerchief, embroidered with a single golden letter, L. I ran my thumb over the stitching as I walked, remembering the night it came into my life. That memory stirred something messy and hard to hold, a mix of longing, regret, wonder, and heartache. I'd tried to bury it for months, tried to survive by shutting it out. But now, with every swell of my belly, that memory kept resurfacing, uninvited but impossible to ignore. I made my way back to the tiny room I rented in a rundown building that always smelled like cigarette smoke and mold. The pipes leaked, the walls were thin, and the building manager glared at me like I was ruining the place just by existing. On the front steps, two neighbors sat Tal Barrett. One of them saw me and smirked. "Heard she got fired," she said loudly enough to make sure I caught it. The other one laughed. I didn't react. Just pushed past them, unlocked my door, and noticed a piece of paper on the floor, half crumpled by my foot. Another note. I picked it up and read the curling handwriting. "We don't want single mothers ruining the place. Leave, or we'll go to the landlord." My hands trembled with anger, but I didn't lash out. I just folded the note quietly and slipped it into my pocket, right next to the handkerchief. Then I closed the door behind me and sank into the only chair I had, positioned beside the small window. The afternoon light stretched long shadows across the cracked wallpaper, made the room feel colder, lonelier. I felt a tiny kick in my belly, just a flutter. My baby. I placed my hand over the spot and let the motion settle me. Even as tears prickled behind my eyes, that little movement reminded me why I kept going. It was hard not to remember the things they'd said at work, how they whispered that I had no business handling wedding flowers, that I was some kind of stain on the whole idea of love and commitment. No ring, just a belly. I wasn't fit for their perfect bridal dreams. Their words still echoed, but none of them haunted me as deeply as the memory of that one night almost a year ago. It was pouring rain. I'd been stranded after a friend's birthday party, no taxis in sight and my phone completely dead. Cold, wet, and desperate to get out of the storm, I ducked into a nearly empty jazz bar. Inside, a lone musician was pluck Barrett a slow, soulful tune. I took a seat at the bar, still dripping from the rain, jacket soaked through. That's when I saw him. Lucas. He had on a tailored suit, but there was something undone about him. His tie was loose, hair a little messy, like life had tossed him around too. I never asked why he was there, sitting alone with a glass of whiskey. I just knew that when he looked my way, there was something in his eyes that caught me. A sadness I recognized. One that matched my own. We talked like we'd known each other for years, skipping all the small talk. I never got his last name, and he never asked for mine. We shared regrets, half-formed dreams, and talked about how fragile happiness could be. Time slipped by without either of us noticing. It wasn't the drinks or the jazz band playing in the background, it was the way our words fit, raw and unfiltered. I remember he smelled faintly of orchids, I thought to myself. He laughed when I told him, said it was strange but interesting. Who wears orchids? The bar eventually closed, but neither of us was ready to say goodbye. We stood under the awning, rain so abarat us both, Tal Barrett like the world outside didn't exist. Something unspoken tugged us toward the motel nearby. We never said what we were doing, never tried to justify it. That night, it felt like slipping into something fragile and fleeting. I remember the warmth of his hands, the way his voice trembled when he whispered, "I lost everything once. Now I just want something real." I fell asleep wrapped in his arms, the sound of rain tapping gently on the window like a lullaby. When I woke up at dawn, he was gone. All that remained was a note scribbled on motel stationery. "If you ever need to find me, just follow the scent of orchids. Fate will bring us both back to it." He'd also left behind his handkerchief elegantly stitched with a single letter. L. I remember holding it tight, confused and strangely comforted at the same time. I told myself we'd meet again someday. I believed that, for a while. But weeks turned into months, and then came the positive pregnancy test. That's when I realized I had no real way to find him. I asked around at the bar, nobody knew who he was. And just like that, the night that once felt so vivid started to feel like a dream I couldn't hold on to. I made up my mind to do it on my own. Raise this baby with whatever strength I had left. Now, almost 8 months along, I sat in my tiny rented room, the soft colors of twilight washing over the peeling walls. Out the window, the city sparkled in distant neon. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to that night, the quiet music, the warmth in his eyes. I let out a slow breath and clutched the eviction notice against my chest. Life had backed me into a corner. I didn't know who he really was. Not even a clue. He'd worn nice clothes, sure, but I was so caught up in our connection, I never stopped to guess anything about his background. I thought of him as someone like me, just another lonely person trying to feel alive for a night. The thought crept in again, what if I could find him? What if I could tell him about the baby? But I shook it off. I couldn't afford fantasies. Not when I had no job, barely a roof over my head, and a child coming any day now. What I didn't know was that, across the city, Nolan Barrett was searching. From the top floor of a massive glass tower, He stood in his sleek office, CEO of one of the biggest fragrance companies in the world. For months, he hadn't been able to rest. He'd sniffed hundreds of samples, tested scent after scent, but nothing ever came close to the one he remembered from that rainy night. A haunting blend of orchid, rain, and something else he couldn't name, something that wrapped around his memory like silk. His employees thought he was just chasing an elusive formula, obsessed with some rare perfume note. They didn't know the truth. He never told them. What he was really chasing was me. That one night had snapped him out of a grief he never thought he'd escape. And every day that passed without finding me felt like a betrayal of what he'd felt that night. So he spared no expense. He hired scent experts, researchers, and trackers. Their mission: locate anything in the city that gave off that same orchid-like trace. Hospitals, boutiques, florist shops, anywhere that might hint at the fragrance. But every search came up empty. Lucas's frustration grew. Late at night, he'd sit in front of his screen, scrolling through city records, trying to chase a trail that had long since gone cold. All he had was a name, Sophie. No last name, not even a full memory of one. He thought maybe I'd mentioned a friend that night, or something about my father being gone, but there was nothing solid to hold on to. It got to the point where he started wondering if maybe he'd imagined half of it. Then, out of nowhere, came a lucky break. A second-hand shop that sold old odds and ends had taken in a used blanket, one that carried a faint orchid scent, mixed with something else he couldn't quite place. The shopkeeper mentioned it had come from somewhere near the flower district. That was enough. Nolan grabbed onto that tiny clue like it was gold. Dozens of phone calls followed. Bribes, subtle questions, and eventually, a note from a local laundry service. They recognized the embroidery on a handkerchief, a single, elegant L. And just like that, the trail began to take shape. Piece by piece, it all started aligning. Whispers about a pregnant woman who sometimes left behind the light scent of orchids. Could it really be true? Could there be a child out there, his child? The thought sent adrenaline rushing through him. He quietly sent people out into neighborhoods, searching for a woman named Sophie, visibly pregnant. Meanwhile, I had no idea any of this was happening, no clue that his search was closing in around my small corner of the city. On the same day I lost my job, something shifted. That evening, one of Lucas's informants tracked a laundry receipt to an old, crumbling apartment building. He didn't wait. Dressed in a dark coat and ignoring all his advisors, Nolan drove out himself in a black car that blended in with traffic. When he arrived, the place looked as bleak as the records made it sound: peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and neighbors who glared at outsiders like they were trouble. Still, he got out, his heart racing at the thought, she could be in there. The informant pointed to a second-floor apartment. Nolan took the stairs two at a time, brushing past faded graffiti and scraps of paper pinned to the walls. One note said something cruel: get her out. He felt fury rise in his chest. Who could treat a pregnant woman like this? At the door, he paused. There was a soft floral note in the air: jasmine, maybe lilies, maybe orchids. He couldn't tell if it was real or just his memory playing tricks. His hand trembled as he knocked. A pause. Then footsteps. The door creaked open just a sliver, and there I was. Face damp with tears, belly unmistakable beneath a stretched sweater. We both froze, recognition crashing over us in silence. I stared at him, this man from that night, the one who left behind a handkerchief and a memory I could never shake. Now he was standing in front of me, wearing a sharp business coat and carrying a quiet kind of power that filled the doorway. I parted my lips, but nothing came out. I was too stunned. Then, he swallowed and said softly, "You really thought I wouldn't find you? You thought I wouldn't recognize the woman who smelled like rain, and orchids, and something I couldn't let go of?" My heart thundered in my chest. In that instant, everything I'd bottled up for months, every lonely night, every whispered insult, every moment of hopelessness, rose all at once. I broke down crying, turning my face away, embarrassed by the peeling walls and flickering lamp. But he stepped closer, gently easing the door open without pushing. He looked around, really looked, and saw what my life had become. The cracks in the paint. The single chair. The eviction note on the table that simply said, "Leave." He looked at me, really looked, and I could see it in his face. He saw the exhaustion written in the lines around my eyes, the quiet ache I carried in how I sat today. Carefully, he placed a small bouquet of white orchids on the edge of the table. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice thick, like it hurt to speak. "I'm sorry for disappearing that night. I didn't know how to ask for more, and I had no way to find you. I didn't even know your full name. But I swear I never stopped trying." I sank down onto my sagging old couch, arms wrapped tightly around myself. The baby kicked, just a small shift, but he noticed. His eyes widened. It was real. He dropped to his knees beside me, not caring that his expensive coat was brushing against the dusty floor. "This child, it's mine," he asked gently, even though I could tell he already knew. I nodded through tears, hand pressed to my mouth to keep the sob from escaping too loud. I tried to say something, anything, but all I managed was a broken string of words. I tried. I didn't. I couldn't. Everything, the fear, the relief, the heartbreak spilled over at once. And then his arms were around me. Careful. Hesitant. But warm. Solid. I let myself cry into his shoulder, the kind of crying that comes from holding it all in too long. Outside the apartment door, I knew neighbors were watching. I could feel it, their curiosity hanging in the hallway like fog. The same people who left nasty notes and whispered judgment were now frozen in silence, seeing a powerful man, someone who practically radiated wealth and authority, holding the very woman they'd torn down. He stayed with me until I could breathe again. Then he stood, looked around, and said, calm but firm, "We're not staying here. Pack what you need." I hesitated. My rent wasn't paid. I had no job, no future lined up. I started to explain, to tell him I couldn't just leave. But he cut me off gently. "You're not spending one more night in a place that treats you like garbage." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. I wiped my face and nodded, too tired to argue. I stuffed the eviction notice into my bag, gave one last glance at the room that had held too many tears, and followed him. In the hallway, people moved aside, eyes wide. The silence was louder than any insult they'd ever thrown. No one said a word as we walked past. Just watched. Outside, the sleek black car waited. He helped me in, careful of my belly, not even Blynn Barrett at the stairs from passers-by. Once the door shut and the engine purred to life, I leaned back against the seat, overwhelmed. My entire life had shifted in a matter of minutes. I clutched the seatbelt, stealing a glance at Lucas. His face was calm, but I could see the worry behind his eyes. "I won't push you," he said softly. "But let me help you. Let me take care of you, both of you." I gave a small nod, still unsure how to respond, but the weight of no longer being completely alone lifted some of the fear off my chest. As we drove through the glowing city, neon streaks painted the windows. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion take over. He brought me to a penthouse, one of the tallest in the city. I felt like an imposter the second we stepped into the private elevator. Everything was too clean, too quiet. Staff bowed slightly as we passed. My old sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor like they didn't belong. The suite was breath to Barrett. Soft lighting. Elegant art. Floor-to-ceiling windows Lou Barrett out over the skyline like something out of a dream. I sank onto a couch so plush it felt like air. It was probably worth more than everything I owned combined. Nolan dismissed the staff with a quiet word. Then he knelt in front of me again, his eyes falling gently on my belly. "How far along?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. "Almost 8 months," I said, barely louder than him. He exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. "So it's really mine," he said, not as a question, but as a truth he was finally letting himself believe. I nodded again. He closed his eyes, and I saw tears glisten behind his lashes. "I never forgot you," he said. He looked at me, eyes full of things he hadn't said until now. "That night. I was broken," he admitted. "You gave me something I didn't think I could feel again, hope. But I had to leave. I woke up early, had to catch a flight for a crisis overseas, something urgent with my company. I left the handkerchief behind, thin Barrett maybe, just maybe, would find each other again." I reached out and gently placed my hand over his, silently telling him he wasn't the only one who had let things slip. I hadn't exactly searched for him either. Not beyond as Barrett around at the bar. I figured he was just a regular guy, not the billionaire founder of a global fragrance empire. The days that followed felt like W.A. Barrett up inside someone else's life. I had to adjust slowly, one careful step at a time. Nolan insisted I see a doctor he trusted. The baby was healthy, the doctor said, but I wasn't getting the rest or nutrition I needed. After that, his staff started delivering things, quietly, without fuss. New clothes. Fresh food. Prenatal vitamins. He hovered, but not too close. Always Barrett sure I had space. What stunned me most wasn't just the luxury of the penthouse or the staff or the way he handled high-level decisions while pacing the marble floors. It was learning that he wasn't just wealthy. He was the Nolan Barrett, the man behind a fragrance empire known around the world. I watched him take phone calls each evening, giving orders, shifting massive donations toward charities, managing press, and still, he kept Lou Barrett at me like I mattered. That familiar orchid scent lingered around him. I realized it was probably from his own lab, a custom blend. The same scent I'd caught that night in the bar. It should have been a clue, but I never imagined the scale of who he was. Even then, I kept my guard up. I wasn't sure I belonged in his world, with all its polish and poise. But then he'd glance at me, softly, kindly, and I'd feel a flicker of safety I hadn't known in a long time. When word spread within his company that he had found someone, the internal buzz started. Nolan knew how to handle publicity, though. Before anyone could speculate too much, he simply introduced me to a few key staff members. "This is Sophie," he'd say calmly. "She's under my protection." They bowed, nodded respectfully. But I could see it in their eyes, they were curious. In hushed voices, I overheard bits and pieces. "He found her. The one he's been searching for." Some of them even sounded relieved. As if they'd watched him drift through life like a ghost for too long. I pieced it together over time. After the death of someone close to him, Nolan had withdrawn. Our night together had pulled him out of that darkness. That's why I mattered so much to him. Why the memory meant everything. It was a lot to process. But deep down, I realized our stories mirrored each other more than I thought. Two lonely, broken people who met by chance on a rainy night. Meanwhile, outside his world, news of my disappearance reached the very people who once mocked me. And oh, the tone had changed. My phone lit up with calls from my old landlord, suddenly full of apologies, even offering me a better lease if I wanted to return. The women at the flower shop messaged non-stop. Even Ms. Hartley left a voicemail, stammering something about reconsidering the situation. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't interested in revisiting their cruelty. I'd spent too long being ashamed of who I was. Now, I just wanted to move forward, even if I wasn't quite sure what that future looked like yet. Sensing I was struggling with all the change, Nolan sat down beside me one evening and asked, gently, "Do you want to stay private, or step into the public eye?" The baby's due date was getting close, and I knew I couldn't hide forever. Eventually, people would see us together. I took a deep breath and told him, "I don't need headlines. But I'm done hiding. I've carried enough shame to last a lifetime." So, in a quiet but carefully planned moment, Nolan made it official. He introduced me as his partner. The future mother of his child. At one of Lucas's high-profile philanthropic galas, everything changed. We arrived arm in arm, and the crowd, dressed in glittering gowns and sharp suits, parted around us like a tide. I wore a dress he'd picked out, simple but elegant. I'd refused anything flashy. I wanted to feel like myself, not a decoration. As we entered, the room quieted. It reminded me of the silence that fell back at the alumni event where I'd been humiliated, but this time, it wasn't mockery that filled the air. It was curiosity. Cautious respect. No one dared say anything cruel. Not in front of Lucas. His presence alone was enough to shut down any snide remarks. If people whispered anything ugly, they did it behind forced smiles and champagne flutes. Part of me was relieved. But another part felt hollow. It was hard not to notice how quickly people changed their tune when money and influence entered the picture. Just weeks earlier, I was the outcast. Now, I was suddenly worth their attention. I smiled politely, nodded. Let Nolan do most of the Tal Barrett, the handshakes, the grand gestures. At his side, I did feel safer, but I also knew I couldn't disappear into his world. I had to hold on to myself, too. The true shift came later. Nolan decided to hold a press conference. He wanted to announce the launch of a new initiative, the Delacroix Foundation. He named it after me, using my last name, and said it would be in honor of everything I'd been through. "It's for the women who've been cast aside," he told me. "The ones mocked, forgotten, like you were. I can't undo what was done to you. But maybe we can make sure fewer women go through it in the future." That nearly broke me. So we stood together in front of the cameras, in a quiet, intimate space. Nolan explained the foundation's mission, to provide housing, medical care, job training, all for single mothers and pregnant women. Society had turned its back on. Journalists stared. Some of them recognized me, maybe from gossip or viral photos of my old apartment. But I stood there calmly, smiling gently. I wasn't that broken girl anymore. I was something steadier. Stronger. The baby was due soon, and as Nolan stood beside me, his hand brushing mine, we became a quiet image of something many had never seen before, two people who'd met through hardship, choosing to build something beautiful out of it. When the press conference ended, the room erupted in applause. I saw tears in the crowd, even among the reporters. The story hit harder than most expected. And the ripple effect came fast. People who'd once ridiculed me either vanished or scrambled to rewrite history. My old landlord issued a public apology and offered glowing letters of recommendation. Even Ms. Hartley from the flower shop sent a handwritten note, apologizing and blaming business pressure for letting me go. I didn't feel anger. Not really. But I didn't go back either. I'd moved past the world of wedding bouquets and bitter stares. Those flowers had once represented everything I didn't have. Now, I had something bigger. I put my energy into the Delacroix Foundation. I met with women who had been pushed aside for the same reasons I had: being pregnant, poor, alone. I listened to their stories and saw myself in them. The fear, the shame, the quiet strength they didn't know they had. Nolan funded the foundation. But I gave it its heart. And as my due date crept closer, I realized I wasn't just preparing to welcome a child, I was helping build a place for others to land when the world knocked them down. The headlines shifted overnight. Billionaire Nolan Barrett stands by pregnant partner. Secret mother found, now forging a philanthropic legacy. From scorn to symbol, the woman who rose against the odds. I tried not to read them. I focused instead on what really mattered: our baby's health, building a calm, stable home, and Ma Barrett's sure each day ended in peace, not chaos. Nolan understood. He gave me space but never drifted too far. Every evening, he'd return from work, kneel beside me, and press his ear gently to my belly. I'd hear him whisper to our daughter, promising to protect us no matter what. In those quiet moments, the bond between us deepened in a way I never could have imagined, especially from a night that once seemed like nothing more than chance. Maybe it was destiny. Or maybe just love, the kind that grows slowly, through shared silences and memories that smell like rain, jazz, and orchids. And when our daughter was finally born, a tiny girl with dark, soft hair, I was overcome with gratitude. In that hospital room, watching Nolan cradle her, tears stream Barrett down his cheeks, I felt something I hadn't known in a long time: peace. My mom had passed years ago, but somehow, I felt her presence in that moment. My dad too, I could still hear his voice reminding me that small acts of kindness, especially in dark moments, can shape a life. As I looked at our little girl's fingers, so delicate and new, I knew a new chapter had begun. The shame, the judgment, they were still there, but only as faded shadows behind the light of what we'd created. Not long after Clara's birth, Nolan held a banquet, not for show, but to formally introduce the foundation, and now, our family. Some of the very people who once whispered behind my back now stood in line to greet me. They smiled, cooed at the baby, offered warm wishes. I returned their kindness, but never forgot. The world, I'd learned, loves a success story, but it feeds on weakness, too. I kept my poise, wore a soft pastel dress, my hair swept up simply. I wasn't there for approval. I was there to stand tall, in my own name. We named her Clara. Maybe for the flower I once sold in buckets. Maybe for that quiet orchid scent that once floated between me and Nolan on a rainy night in a bar. Maybe both. That night didn't end in revenge. It ended in grace. Sometime later, I went back to the old building where I used to live. Not for closure, I already had that. Just to leave something behind. I brought a hamper of baby supplies and left it by the door of the unit I once called home. I added a note, for anyone in need. I didn't knock. Didn't look for old neighbors. My life wasn't tied to their opinions anymore. As we drove away, I passed the flower shop too. Through the window, I saw a new girl behind the counter trimming stems. Ms. Hartley was still there, fussing in the background. I considered stepping inside. Maybe to say hi. Maybe not. In the end, I stayed outside. I brushed Clara's cheek as she cooed softly in the backseat and let the past stay behind that glass window. I owed them nothing. Now, Nolan and I had found a rhythm, our days filled with the little sounds of a baby, the work of the foundation, the quiet hum of something real and good: Barrett root. At night, we talked. I told him everything, every wound I'd carried, every time I'd felt invisible or unworthy. He listened with a kind of heartbreak in his eyes. Then he shared his story, the loneliness of building an empire, the emptiness he couldn't fill until that one night with me. We built something from that. Not out of power. Not out of need. But out of understanding. He used to say the scent of orchids haunted him. Now, he said, it lived in the air around me, in my presence, in Clara's laughter, in the life we'd built. When we finally married, it wasn't a show. No press, no paparazzi. Just a quiet garden, a handful of close friends, and a breeze that smelled faintly of flowers. The air carried orchid blossoms that day. And so did our promise that this love was more than a story. It was a home. A family. A beginning. Our marriage was more than a ceremony, it was a quiet victory over the shame and loneliness that had once wrapped themselves around my life like chains. I wore a simple white dress that fit my post-pregnancy body with grace, not hiding anything, just honoring where I'd been. Nolan stood beside me, in a soft-colored suit that reminded me of the one he'd worn that night at the bar, but this one felt lighter, like the burden had lifted. Under an arch of blooming orchids, we took each other's hands and said our vows softly, so soft, it felt like only the wind and our daughter could hear them. When the officiant declared us husband and wife, we sealed it with a kiss. Nothing dramatic. Just real. And in that moment, I saw the full arc of everything. I was no longer the woman whispered about by neighbors, no longer the employee shamed by her boss in the back of a flower shop. I was a partner. A mother. A woman loved deeply by a man who changed everything with a promise. I didn't need to speak it aloud, but I said goodbye to the judgment, the rejection, the years of carrying humiliation like a second skin. I let them go. Not to forget, but to remind myself how far I'd come. In the months that followed, the Delacroix Foundation grew beyond anything I could have imagined. I helped lead it with a quiet steadiness, focusing on the things I knew mattered: safe housing for single moms, job programs, medical care, legal aid for women threatened with eviction or worse. I traveled often, quiet visits to new outreach centers, Clara bundled up in my arms, smiling at the women who saw their own stories reflected in mine. I didn't give speeches or pose for cameras. I listened. I sat with them. And sometimes, I just held their hands. The critics. They faded fast, buried beneath the wave of public support. The media stopped trying to scandalize me. They called me the quiet mother who sparked the city's largest philanthropic movement. But I didn't cling to that label. I knew how quickly admiration could turn. So I stayed grounded. Focused. And then, one afternoon, months after the whirlwind had settled, I stood in a corner of a brand new Delacroix Foundation Center. The walls were strung with balloons, the floor padded with mats and scattered toys. Laughter filled the space like music. Nolan stood across the room, holding Clara in his arms, his smile so full and easy, it stopped me in my tracks. That's when I realized I didn't need anything more than this. This love. This life. This purpose. The woman I used to be, the one who flinched when neighbors glared, who held her breath waiting for the next insult, she was gone. In her place stood someone calmer, stronger. Someone who had walked through judgment and come out whole, not by fighting back loudly, but by living with quiet resolve. I looked over at Lucas, and as our eyes met, I thought again about how unlikely it all was. A random jazz bar. A night of rain. A conversation between two strangers carrying their own secret pain. A single handkerchief with the letter L. Somehow, all of it had brought us here. I reached out and took his free hand, giving it a soft squeeze. He looked down at me and smiled, one of those smiles that says everything without needing a word. And in that simple moment, I knew. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. He leaned in and kissed my temple, gentle and sure. Clara gurgled in his arms, like she could already feel the warmth of home wrapped around us. And in that moment, I felt no sadness for what I'd left behind, not the place that had once humiliated me, not the neighbors who stared, not the coworkers who laughed when my back was turned. I'd built something new. A life made from grace, compassion, and quiet strength. A world that honored the kind of love that doesn't boast, but endures. For the rest of my life, I knew I'd hold on to the memory of that night in the bar. The hush in the air. The scent of orchids. The way two strangers found each other, not because everything was perfect, but because they'd both been broken in just the right way to understand one another. I felt a quiet wave of gratitude for all of it. Even the cruel parts. Because every step, every scar, had led me here. If this story moved you, share it. Leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories where quiet women rise from shame with grace and where fate always remembers the scent of truth.